Hi!
My name is Rebecca Hillers.
And I'm Roger Hillerstrom, and this is Pink Chair Therapy. Rugged though it be here.
Hey you guys, welcome to Pink Chair Therapy, finally. Today you're going to be watching the first video in a mini-series that we're doing where we're tackling the topics of addiction, codependence, and recovery, which is such a broad spectrum of subjects. Today we're going to be focusing on just addiction cycles, addiction switching, kind of the underlying issues of addiction, and giving you a ton of tips for how to approach recovery, how to embrace a successful recovery. Now, near the end, we do kind of start getting into that codependent dynamic, kind of the experience of the partner, the family, the community dynamic around the addict. But at that point, I will kind of pop in and cut us off because as we were preparing these episodes, we realized and ultimately decided the importance of each of these topics was so great. We can't just like cram that into one episode, which is why we decided to do this little mini series. So each of these topics really gets the attention that it needs and deserves. So keep in mind, this was the first video we ever recorded. Literally the first day we ever sat in front of a camera for this whole project. So it's rough. It's actually rough enough that the week after we did this take, we actually re-recorded the entire episode in hopes that we could make it better. But this first day was so good. My dad was just totally on fire and we could not recreate it naturally. So because of that, I've decided, you know what? We're just gonna release the original in all of its technically glitched glory and hope that you can kind of just ignore the technical annoyances of not knowing what we're doing. So I'm not going to point them out because I feel like maybe if I don't point them out, you won't notice them. We'll see. Either way, I'm hoping you can look past them and just really be able to appreciate the awesomeness of the content. We are learning. There's the good news. Without further ado, welcome to Pink Chair Therapy. Let me introduce you to my dear friend Lani. We're old friends. We had known each other for years and reconnected, I guess, a few years ago over our husband's addiction. And then a couple weeks ago, I was able to connect with her again, and I have not spoken to her for years. And so we reconnected when I did her hair for the show. And she was just telling me about how the past few years, how her husband has been living in recovery and has been super successful, and just like the impact it's had on her and her family and him. And it's just been amazing. And it was so cool to hear her story and so cool being able to see her 3 years later. Because it was about a little over 3 years, I think, between when I first connected with her and we were both in the depths, and then now being able to walk with her in this totally different world of living in recovery. So,
Well, and for me, it was a privilege to watch that conversation and how you guys reconnected clearly. And there are a number of things that came out in that I think are worth us talking about. It's just worth kind of focusing on, because I think a lot of times some of the things that she was able to talk about, you guys were able to talk about, are missed, that aren't really talked about. One of the things that she brought up was the whole issue of switching addictions.
Cool.
Oh yeah, alcohol is really not like, I mean,
it's not an issue,
but I mean, I would argue that, and I think he would probably say the same thing, if all of the issues that had triggered substance abuse had been dug into and analyzed and not like gotten past, but like grieved and then moved forward from, then this probably wouldn't have been an issue. And so I think that, there was still...
Yeah, because it's the inside that's...
Right.
The outward happenings is because of something inside. Yeah. So whether it's alcohol or masturbation or whatever.
Right. And so I would argue that, if if that deep stuff had been happening, then he probably wouldn't necessarily need to do what he was doing right now, because some of that stuff would have been dug out. It would have been less of an issue. But I mean, I also would argue that what he's doing now is probably awesome for his recovery from substances as well.
Yeah.
I think that, you know, if he ever was wondering if there would be a relapse, which I don't think really either of us were, but if that was ever a question, but if that was ever a question in his mind, knowing that he's really working through the root of a lot of like the why he did what he did kind of things, I think that takes away any of that like really major concern. Yeah. You know, because I mean, new things always come up, right? But if you're not dealing with stuff that happened to you as a child or adolescent or whatever, if you're not dealing with that, then you're just not ever really going to get past all of the stuff.
Totally.
So then apparently Matt had been an alcoholic, and when they courted, he was in recovery, and so that was open, it was on the table, etc., and he was being successful in that. And it wasn't really until after they were married that his sexual addiction came to the surface. And it sounds like that sexual addiction emerged after recovery from alcoholism. And so I don't know these people, but I know something about recovery, and Matt, that couldn't have been easy. You know, the struggle of getting through alcoholism is tough enough, you know, and the fact that now he is also working through his sexual addiction is admirable. You know, the guy has got to be a very, very hardworking, very committed guy. Yeah. But one of the things I see a lot of is that someone who is going through recovery in one area commonly switches to another addiction, often without even consciously being aware of it. And I think we need to understand what addiction is, because I think a lot of times we look at it as bad behavior, as though it's just a behavior that needs to stop. But that's not true. Right. I always say an alcoholic doesn't drink because he's thirsty. He's drinking because he's escaping something. This is self-medication. And when he takes that away, especially if he doesn't deal with the underlying issues, he is going to need something else to take its place. And that's where we see the concepts of switching addictions, or what we call a dry drunk. You know, a dry drunk is an alcoholic who has stopped drinking but hasn't dealt with his underlying issues. So his life is still the same. He still has the same responses, same fears, same anxiety, same depression. He just isn't medicating with alcohol. And when that happens, he is a setup for switching addictions and doing something else to self-medicate. Right. And that's where we see like an alcoholic who gets lost in gambling or sexual addiction or maybe drugs or something like that, because they are dry, but they're still a drunk. Right.
So what would, as a professional, what would you see as, let's say, an alcoholic?
Right.
Okay, an alcoholic who has a years-long alcohol addiction. Where do you see success in becoming free and living in recovery, truly living in recovery, versus just jumping into another addiction?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there's a handful of components that we look for. Not just stopping the addictive behavior, but a support system so that he has some kind of accountability, as we say, or that's where being involved in some kind of support system like AA or Celebrate Recovery or something like that, where you are surrounded by people who are in different phases of their own recovery who can support you. Another thing with addicts is their cons. They lie. They
to themselves.
To themselves and to others.
Okay.
And so when they are in a support group of other addicts know their spiels. They know their sticks, and they can see through their own denial.
Right.
Denial is another thing that's worth us talking about. We tend to think of denial as though it's lying. And denial is different than lying. Denial is lying to yourself. Denial is looking reality right in the face and saying, that doesn't apply to me. And in addiction, there is a need to have denial in place in order to keep your addiction going.
Right.
And so when we look at someone who is serious about their recovery, they're going to be fighting their denial. They're going to be facing their denial, being able to see that, no, I am in denial, and have other people who are able to say, no, I don't buy that. No, I don't think that's true. No, I think you're in denial.
So for me, coming from a couple of relationships that were deeply ingrained in addiction, the denial was so real.
Yeah.
What does it? I know for the people I was involved with, it was different for both of them. But what does it take for an addict to recognize the denial? Because I feel like the denial was almost literally potentially the only thing that was holding him back from realizing and being able to embrace his issues, his problems, his addiction, right?
Yeah.
So how do you approach someone you love or yourself as an addict?
Right.
Like, how do you approach that denial? How do you break down that wall? Because that's like so...
Yeah. Denial, very seldom is broken without a crisis.
Okay.
Without something that no longer works. We call it hitting rock bottom.
Right.
Hitting bottom. So an alcoholic reaches his bottom when his life no longer works. Someone who loves him has left, he's lost his job, he's lost his house, he's bankrupt, whatever. It is not working anymore. And so his denial just can't stay intact. Now, some people have what we call high bottom drunks. Some people are low bottom drunks. High bottom drunks is someone who sees through denial without their world falling absolutely apart. A low bottom drunk is someone whose world just doesn't work anymore. But very seldom do people get out of that denial, because most have been there for years. They don't get out of the denial without some kind of really intense crisis. And a lot of times that crisis is initiated by someone who loves them. Someone who says, I will no longer do this. I'm sorry, I can't stay with you, or whatever. Or a boss that fires them, or something, something that says, no more.
Yeah.
No more, I can't do that anymore.
Yeah.
And that's where denial begins to be broken through.
Okay.
But denial works great. It works great.
Unfortunately,
yeah.
yeah.
Just like an addiction. If addiction doesn't work, people wouldn't be addicts.
Right.
It is effective in self-medicating the things they're afraid of, whether it's depression or anxiety or maybe some childhood trauma or whatever.
Yeah.
They are pushing down things that they cannot manage in other ways.
Yeah.
And the addiction is effective.
Yeah, totally. That was something that we talked about a lot when I was in couples therapy with an addict, and it was very like the word that I always use, and I think it's because he always used it, was numbing out. You whatever you're running from, or whatever memory you're suppressing or pain you're avoiding, whatever it is, you need something to numb it, whether it's heroin or alcohol or orgasm, whatever it is. You're using something to numb that memory or pain, whatever it is, right? And so it totally makes sense that someone who realizes, okay, let's say they overcome their denial of being an addict or being an alcoholic, and then they say, okay, I'm sober, because their life stopped working. Right? Someone left them or something, so they get sober from alcohol. But they haven't dealt with this underlying current of...
because they started drinking or using for a reason. There was something there. And there's a good argument to be made for any addict. And any addiction is shame-based. It is something I feel bad about me. And I don't want to feel bad about me, and I don't feel like I can have a solution for feeling bad about me, and so I then start this behavior that, by golly, can hide it. And often it starts in adolescence, which is a tough time to begin with. A lot of self-esteem issues, trying to develop identity and all that stuff. But it starts with shame, and I run from the shame rather than resolving the shame. And so now I've been drinking for 20 years, and my wife has left me, and my life has fallen apart, and so I stopped drinking. But I have to deal with that shame that I've been running from for 20 years, which is not an easy thing to do, to really begin unraveling that. Because if I stopped drinking, wait a minute, it was the drinking that I felt bad about. That's why I lost my job. That's why my wife left me. So now I no longer drink. So isn't that resolution?
Right.
Now, I think one of the complicating features that's probably good for us to understand is we have these two terms in our culture that we use interchangeably. One is guilt and one is shame.
Yes.
And we talk about those as though they're equivalent, and they are not the same thing. They are not. Matter of fact, they hardly even overlap. But again, because our language has used them so often,
Okay, so what's the difference then?
well, guilt has no emotional component to it. Guilt is not something I feel. Guilty is something that I am. It's a result of a behavior.
Okay.
And so when I break the law, I'm guilty. Doesn't matter how I feel. The analogy I use is I'm backing out of my driveway and I bump into my neighbor's car and I dent his fender. But I don't realize it. Didn't realize I did it, so I drive away. I'm guilty. I'm guilty, and my insurance company will verify that. I am responsible for fixing that fender because I'm guilty. But I felt fine. Wasn't even aware of it. Doesn't matter how you feel.
Yeah.
You are guilty. Now, nice thing about guilt always has a direction. There's always something I could do with guilt. I can repent, I can pay restitution, I can confess, I can do something to resolve guilt. But none of that has any feeling attached to it. Now, shame is a feeling, and it's a bad feeling. And I do lots of wild things to not feel the shame. Now, when guilt and shame operate together, that's the best of all worlds, because shame is motivational. I will do something to get rid of my shame. Guilt has a direction. I can do something, but I don't do anything about guilt if I feel fine. So when I feel ashamed of what I did, now I do something to resolve my shame. Okay. I pay my restitution, I get my insurance company on the line, I do whatever I have to do. Now I have a direction.
Or you drink alcohol?
Alcohol does not relieve shame.
Right.
See, so for instance, when I have done something bad and I feel bad about it, and so I do something to get rid of that, then I have a direction for my shame to be resolved. But just like guilt can operate separately from shame, shame can operate separately from guilt. And I can feel shame when I haven't done anything wrong. I feel broken, I feel bad, I feel ugly, I feel unlovable. Yeah. And when shame operates separately from guilt, that shame was learned somewhere. I wasn't born that way. Somewhere I developed that shame. And because it would develop someplace, it can be resolved, but it doesn't happen passively. I need to begin to understand where it came from, where I learned that, how did I decide that about myself, who taught me that, what experience did I have that gave me that, so that I can begin separating from the source of that shame to what I really am. Because that shame doesn't describe me. It's something I learned somewhere. Yeah. And so an addict started drinking, using, acting out to squelch that experience of shame. And now they've done it for years. And now what they have is they have compiled guilt. Because they've done nasty things because of their addiction. So they've hurt people and they just, and so their life has fallen apart because of guilt. And so now they stop drinking as though that's the source of this. Right. And once I've stopped drinking and I stopped, hurting people and stealing things and whatever, that should be fine. But wait a minute, we've got shame we got to deal with that's underlying all of this. Right. And that's where treatment comes in. That's where a recovery program comes in. People don't go to recovery for a week or two. Right. They go to recovery for years. Yeah. And it's not because it's to get sober. It's to deal with those underlying issues so they can stay sober. Right. Yeah. And switching addictions is a part of that. If you haven't dealt with underlying shame, it's going to bubble up. Yeah. And you're going to have something else that you medicate it with. And so that's where, listening to Lani, my picture is, oh gosh, Matt's done a lot of work. Yeah. Because, an alcoholic in recovery, that means he dealt with some stuff. Came out sideways, sexual addiction, up back into recovery. Right. He's got those underlying issues that he is now dealing with that will benefit him and his wife and his kids. Huge. And oh my gosh, it's changing generational problems. Yeah. But it's a lot of work. Yeah. It does not come easily. So my hat is off to Matt. Yeah. He is, that is heroic. Yeah. Because it doesn't come easily.
It takes, I think, it takes a lot of courage. Yeah. To be able to get to that point in any addiction. Right. And being able to face yourself. Because I think when you're holding all this shame that started with, whatever. Right. But once you actually get past the denial and you're looking at yourself in this mirror of
Right.
all the things that you've done and the people that you've hurt, it really takes a lot of courage to continue looking in that mirror.
Right.
And start dealing with those things. Like, I really, so much respect for people who are in recovery, because
Oh,
it
yeah.
really does take a lot of courage.
Oh, it does.
Not only just to get sober and like live without addiction, but all the pain that's caused by addiction.
Oh, yeah.
It's so...
Well, and to be able to trust people. So, for instance, in a recovery program like AA, part of the goal is I got to develop relationships with people that I trust, who can confront me, who I will believe they have my best interests in mind. So they call me on my stuff, and they tell me
Yeah.
when they don't believe me, and they believe that I'm lying or I'm in denial or whatever.
Right.
And I'm willing to take that from them and ponder what they're having to say. Same thing's true for a therapist. You know, it's when you're in recovery, it is a good idea to find a therapist that you trust, who you can
Yeah.
let know you, who can see through your stuff, who can
Yeah.
build a relationship with you, and not just give you direction like a counselor who's going to give you advice, but someone who can see your fears and engage on that level
Yeah.
of trust, that you're willing to take
Yeah.
in what they're willing to say, and they're willing to address you in ways that you will hear. That's a part of recovery. Recovery doesn't happen in isolation. It happens in relationship.
Yes.
And so building healthy relationships, and not everybody is trustworthy for a healthy relationship,
Mm-hmm.
but finding people who will understand you, understand your process of recovery, and walk through you with it. And that's where these recovery programs come in that are so valuable.
Yeah.
As well as finding someone you trust, whether it's a friend or a therapist or a pastor, who's willing to invest in you
Yeah.
and not just make you feel good, but to really walk through you with what you're going to have to face.
Right.
Because
Yeah.
a lot of that's going to be denial, and inevitably it's going to involve facing some shame. Shame inevitably is lies that I believed about myself that have kept me trapped
Right.
and given me something to escape.
Yeah.
Important stuff, just not easy.
Yeah.
Not easy.
Yeah. No, I'm really glad that came out of that conversation, because
Oh, yeah.
I think I have had a lot of friends in the past who I would say are high-functioning alcoholics
Mm-hmm.
who
Right.
get sober,
Yeah. Right.
right?
Right.
Who
They
get
get dry.
sober. They
Yeah,
get dry.
right.
Exactly.
Yes.
And we just don't recognize the underlying issues as much as we should.
Right.
You know what I mean? And maybe it's not just my generation. It's probably everyone. It's probably every generation. But it's just realizing it's not about the alcohol. It's not about the substance. It's not about
Right.
whatever the substance is.
Right.
It's about what you're numbing out from.
Right.
It's about what you're covering up. And if you don't deal with that, it's just going to be a new substance.
Oh, yeah.
That's huge. I think that's a conversation that needs to be like discussed more.
Well, and I don't think it's your generation at
No.
all. I think if we look at just the evolution of treatment, alcoholic treatment, at the, in the beginning of the last century, so, early 1900s,
Yeah.
alcoholism was a sin. It was bad behavior. It was a moral issue. And so if you drank too much, it was because you're just a bad person, Now, it wasn't until the 1930s where Bill Wilson and, the whole beginning of what we call the medical model, where I don't know who Bill Wilson was, but he was brilliant. He really, he had the components. Because if you understand shame, you understand, I'm not going to be successful in dealing with addiction until I deal with this shame, this low self-esteem, this self-contempt that I carry. And when we deal with it as a crime or as a sin or as a moral weakness, we feed that low self-esteem. We feed that self-shame. Well, what Wilson did was he said, well, this is a disease. This is a disease. Sorry, you've got the disease. Well, interesting thing about a disease is it's not your fault. Sorry. But the other hand is you are the only one responsible for your symptoms. Nobody can get you better but you. But it's this disease. Now you understand we can't isolate it as a disease,
Right.
but we know that it responds best. The most effective treatment is this disease model. And I think it's because we separate the emotional issues from the physical addiction. And they go side by side. So we say, I can join you in this. You've got this disease. And so the resolution is don't ever drink. You're allergic. You got this toxin, alcohol. Anytime you drink, you can't stop. sorry, it's just what you have to do to live, because you will always be addicted all your days. And so,
Interesting.
yeah, and so I can separate that without it having to feed my shame. But it's nobody else's fault either. I can't blame someone else. I can't hold you responsible. It's not you who drive me to drink.
Right.
It's I've got this disease and I have got to be responsible for it. Brilliant.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Just a very nice piece. And so they put together this AA thing. Now, that went on for about 30 years, all right? So it was in the early 60s, we started seeing a little broader picture of alcoholism. I always laugh. One of my favorite shows is Andy and Mayberry.
Yes.
You know?
Yes.
Andy Mayberry. Fabulous show. Wonderful morals. Love that show. Interesting character in it is Otis.
Yes.
Otis the drunk. What an interesting, this is kind of the epitome of the view of alcoholism in the early 60s. He's cute. He's cute. We like him.
Yeah.
He locks himself up in jail himself, sobers up, leaves the next day. But every show, nobody is addressing this pathetic character who is an addict. He is absolutely under the control of alcohol. Right, because the whole town adapts to it, you know. But so we don't see the agony this guy is in because it's a cute show. But that's the way we looked at it back then. Now, what we started seeing was people would enter, we get this alcoholic who now wants to begin recovery, so we put him in a program, get him in a 28-day program, goes through all the hoops. And then he goes back home, and we find out 6 months later he's relapsing. And we began to see that, there is something in the home that feeds relapse. And then we developed this concept of a codependent, which is just interesting. Nowadays, give it another 40 years, and the term codependent has gotten so watered down, it means so many things these days. But when it was first coined, what we found was the family of the addict had adapted to the addiction. They had all developed their own coping skills of rescuing, solving, fixing, coping with this, this alcohol. So the alcoholic had lots of reasons why he didn't have to face his alcoholism, because everybody else was doing it for him. Now he goes out and gets sober. He comes back. Everybody's still got their stuff. They're all doing the same things they've always done.
Right.
And so we find this relapse. So we started looking at alcoholism as a relational issue, as a family issue. And so we, rule of thumb is every addict needs about 12 codependents around him to keep his addiction going. Right.
That's crazy.
Yes. And so with
So
AA,
all those 12 people need to either be gone from the life,
right,
or go to Al-Anon.
Right. Well, and that's why we say, an addict, an alcoholic who's going to stay sober, he needs a change in his surroundings. His support system needs a change because he's got a lot of people that are invested in him staying in his addiction. And a lot of those people are addicts themselves.
Oh my gosh, that's
and
great,
some of those people are people who need someone to rescue.
Yes.
And you got to be sick if I'm going to rescue you. So I have and a lot of that's not conscious. These aren't bad people. As a matter of fact,
that's me.
Really good. Yes, right. And so it is a very kind, good thing that's done in ignorance,
Yeah,
and so then we, so in the 60s, 70s, 80s, we have the Al-Anon developing, which is AA for codependence.
Yeah, so amazing.
And the whole concept of, wait a minute, I need someone to fix. I measure my success by someone else's joy, happiness, contentment, etc. Which means I need unhappy people around me to keep being successful. Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And so that also began to evolve till we are where we are now.
Yeah.
And that is, really, we have two addictions.
Yeah.
One is addiction to a substance or a behavior, etc. And the other is the addiction to a relationship.
A dependent relationship
Where my value comes from being able to make you happy, sober.
Oh my gosh.
Behavior, yes.
Makes me sick too.
It is, but it is.
I mean, just because I see it reflected so much in my own life, and like how I just continued in that cycle for so long.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's so hard to it's so hard to recognize, even when you're told. I knew.
Yeah.
I went to Al-Anon.
Right.
People told me, but
yeah,
it's so hard to recognize.
Well,
and grasp.
In the same way, an addict has to reach a crisis point to get through their denial. Same thing has to happen with a codependent. Their life needs to get to a place where it no longer works, where they can begin facing the fact that even though I'm this really nice person that everybody loves and everybody wants a relationship with, wait a minute, another concept that comes out recently, boundaries. My boundaries are real poor. I don't take care of myself. I ignore my own self-nurturant needs, and I'm constantly focused on the needs of someone else.
Right.
And that's an imbalance.
Yeah.
We don't do that well for a lifetime. Eventually things begin to break down.
Yeah.
And that's where we see that addictive cycle in the relationships around an addict. That addict can get sober and etc. Wait a minute, the codependents around him also need to begin making some changes in their own lives.
Yeah.
So there's a lot to it. It's a very
complex.
complex system. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think we're going to pause here because we're kind of getting into the codependence, and that's going to be a whole episode on its own, and we're going to get a lot more deeper into the nuances of codependence and what a codependent addiction looks like. So we're going to pause here, but before we leave, I wanted to leave you with some resources if addiction is something that's kind of hitting home for you, whether it's for you or a loved one or a partner or a family member or something. I want to leave you with some resources on what you were talking about with finding a therapist, finding a community, starting to change these behaviors, and starting the first steps of recovery. So behavior is kind of self-explanatory, but if you're looking for a community, we're going to link some kind of general communities with AA, and what was the other one you talked about?
Celebrate Recovery.
Celebrate Recovery. We're going to link those for you if you want to try to find somewhere in your area that you can get involved. There's also a lot of phone meetings, whether it's for Alcoholics Anonymous or Sexaholics Anonymous, any of the Anonymous. They do a lot of phone communities. So if there's not a group in your particular town, if you live in the boonies or something, there's always a group you can join, even if it's virtual or over the phone. So that's worth looking into.
Well, I would also say, if you are in a spiritual, religious community, it's also a good place to start. Talk to your pastor, talk to your priest, talk to your rabbi. They will typically have ideas, therapists that they know. Nothing magical about that.
Right.
Doesn't mean that that's a good fit, but it's a place to start.
Right, a jump off point.
You can Google Psychology Today. There they will, and your town, typically they will have therapists in your area, and on that you will see, a name, a background, a little bio sketch. It'll talk about what their areas of expertise are. You can shop online, make a phone call, ask questions, interview them, and see what your feel is for that.
Yeah.
Talk to friends. They may have friends of friends that saw a therapist that had a good experience.
Yeah. So we'll link Psychology Today as well if you want to be looking for a therapist, if you want to shop around for a therapist in your area. We'll link Psychology Today in our description as well. And then, like you said, talk to friends, talk to family members, anyone you trust who you think might have a connection to a therapist or experience with therapy. Worth talking to people that you trust to try to get some connections and network there.
Right. Yeah, the point is, get started.
Right.
You take the risk, dial the phone, check it out, begin getting movement going.
Right.
Because that is where it starts.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's where it starts for the addict, the addict, but then there's this whole other side of partners and codependents, which also need to step out and find help for themselves. And I can speak to that from personal experience, but we're going to pause here and we're going to get into that next time.
Great.
Because that's a whole nother world that's going to take hours to cover. So thank you for listening today. If you guys have any questions, leave comments below. You can send me a DM and we might follow up with a video, or I might try to get back to you personally, whatever we have time for. But go ahead and respond and we will do our best to get back to you guys. Like, share, subscribe, and we will see you in our next video.
See you next time.
Bye, you guys.
Beautiful.
I think that's good. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you, Lani. Thank you, Matt.
Yes,
for
thank you.
giving us this glimpse.
Yes.
Yeah. That
Yeah.
was great.
Yeah, no, really do want to say thank you to Lani and her family for being willing to let us pick apart their lives like this.
Yeah, that's great.
I think it's going to benefit a lot of people, and I
Yeah.
think there's hopefully a lot of people who will recognize some needed things
In themselves, right.
Yeah,
Yes, very
totally.
great. Or loved
And
ones.
really, I just want to again point out the reason we're here is to open these conversations
Yeah.
as it's okay. This is life. Like,
Right.
it's okay. Like, we're not here to bring shame on anyone. We're not here.
No one enters adulthood without baggage.
Yes, like
period.
we're all. I'm trying really
Right.
hard not to swear, but we're all screwed up. We all have our stuff,
Right.
and it's okay. You know, we're
Yeah.
here, and I think the most important thing is that we talk about it.
Right.
Because it's about, it's about the shame. It's about all these addictions being, rooted in shame and hidden things. If we're talking about them, they're not hidden anymore. So it's okay to say that something is wrong. It's okay to say that you're experiencing pain. It's okay to talk about those things.
Right.
I know it's hard to find safe people to talk to, but I mean, that's why we're
But
here.
they are out there.
Yeah.
You can find them.
Yeah,
if
you
look.
can. Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. So
Great.
thank you very much.
Thank you. This
for
was great.
talking about all that.
On pink chair therapy.
Yes. We'll see you next time
See you next time.
on Pink Chair Therapy.
Quick thought.
Yeah.